Hi, I'm Ozzie Ostwalt, and welcome to Religion and Life. This week we are joined by Mark Powell, a novelist and professor at Appalachian State, to explore the role of religion in literature and storytelling. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you for having me, Ozzie.
Mark, we're really pleased to have you at our university. Your first year here.
Just here.
The author of 4 novels, a 5th now recently off to press.
Yes.
The most recently published, we have on set here, The Sheltering and The Dark Corner. And we'll return to, I want to talk about The Sheltering perhaps later in the program, but wanted to get that out there that you are a published novelist, but you're also a teaching professor, teaching writing and literature, and have a degree in religion and literature. So how do you juggle all those aspects of your profession? I'm assuming they're all kind of intertwined in some way.
I hope so. I mean, theoretically they are. Yeah, to me it's not so much the idea of juggling at the idea that they inform each other, you know, that hopefully my attempt to making art is deepened by the religion and my religious life is deepened by art. And of course the engagement with students just sort of allows me, almost forces me, right, to sort of bring those things into practice in a very everyday way.
Do your students kind of sit in awe knowing that you're in the classroom of a published novelist?
My students sit in many things. Awe is most definitely not one of them.
Okay. Well, you're considered a Southern writer, I would suppose, or an Appalachian writer perhaps even. And it seems to me that a lot of what we call Southern literature and Appalachian literature is infused with religion. And we get these marvelous depictions of religion in the works of people like Lee Smith or Clyde Edgerton, Flannery O'Connor, and Mark Powell, your work as well. Why do you think religion is so often reproduced, or depictions of religion make up so much a part of the fabric of storytelling in the South?
Well, the South, as you well know, Ozzie, is this Christ-haunted place, right? And personally, I was dipped in it so deeply and so immersively when I was young. It's something, you know, that's going to stay with me forever. And the South traditionally has been such an insular culture, and I think it creates this sort of interesting tension when you start to move out of that insular culture and you start to bring the religion you were maybe, in my case, raised with, and it starts to clash with the world at large. Interesting fiction, interesting art, I think, always comes out of the idea of juxtaposition, right? When things start to ram up against other things. And I think that's what religion largely does, at least religion, serious religion, rather than the sort of superficial religion which sort of permeates so much of American life.
And I want to return maybe to that topic of superficial religion when we're talking about your fiction later in the program. But do you see the South, say in the 21st century, is it changing in any kind of particular way, becoming less regional perhaps? Is it losing some of that Christ-hauntedness that you mentioned?
Certainly, right? It's certainly becoming more homogenized, but I still think it is one of the most interesting regions of the world because there are certain things we continue to cling to. And as I say cling, I immediately think of Obama's comment a few years ago, right, about clinging to gods and guns. Much of it is problematic. Often the things we cling to are the things we should surely let go, and much of what we have released are the things we should have clung to most fervently. It's changing, but just a few years ago I was driving in my hometown, which is in South Carolina, just a small little edge of the mountains town. And going up on one side of the road was a group of bicycle riders, completely in, you know, windsuits on $1,000 bicycles. They were going up one side. Coming down the other were, I don't know what you would call the collective, but a pack of Harley-Davidson motorcycles. And they both paused in the middle so that a tractor with a bale of hay could cross. And I thought, this is such a, you know, interesting image of the South right now. Unique in so many ways, but joining the rest of the world, for better or worse, and so many others.
Your comment suggested that perhaps the South is still clinging to religion and maybe in ways that aren't productive or positive. Is that the role you see religion playing in the South? Is that perhaps, or is that what's coming out in fiction some, that religion is somehow holding the South back, or am I misreading?
I don't think it's religion that's holding the South back. I think it's a lot of archaic constructions that are holding the South back and are holding the entire United States back, right? I mean, if anything this presidential election season has shown us is that there is plenty of clinging to what we should have long since let go. Religion is very often, I think, a crutch for people, a way to refuse to move toward a sort of more progressive, more inclusive view of society, I think of what Dr. King said, right? The true measure of any revelation is, does it expand the beloved community? And that seems to be the thing we so often forget in the South. Are we expanding the notion of the beloved community?
And you see religion perhaps not participating in expanding that?
Well, it works both ways, right? In many ways, religion has driven this. There is a form, a strand of religion that is pushing this beautifully into the world, and exactly the way I understand Christianity should function. And then there are parts of Christianity that continue to sort of be these vestiges of the Old South. And people can lock themselves inside of this because they claim some kind of the authority of God to do such.
Right. So when you describe religion in the South as a kind of crutch, at least in one sense, and religion kind of clinging to some of the vestiges of the Old South, is that implicating religion in some sort of continuation of racism within the kind of structural parts of the South?
Well, it's implicating us, right? And to the extent that we build these churches that do this, absolutely, it's an implication of it. But it's very much also an excuse, I think, for people to refuse to sort of move forward in their sort of larger acceptance of anyone who's different.
Right.
So much of religion in the South, in my experience, and my experience is, I grant, very limited, but so much of my experience is about keeping out the other. And you could keep out the other, which was this nasty, deep-seated desire, because you could go to the authority of your church.
Right.
And you know, this is changing. This is beautifully changing, and there is a sort of progressive strand in so many churches. But also there's not. I mean, we see this thing existing everywhere, I think.
Sure. One of the things that strikes me about the depiction of religion in some Southern literature, and might talk about this in your own work as well, is that it oftentimes tends toward, I think, the stereotypical or toward hyperbole, perhaps. And I've got a couple of images here. It's hard to have images of literature, but I've got a couple of images that might help illustrate the way I think sometimes at least one part of religion is expressed in Southern literature. The first is a picture of Burt Lancaster, a still from the movie Elmer Gantry, which of course was adapted from Sinclair Lewis's 1920s novel, a satire about religion. Here's Burt, and he's got his hands raised. He's preaching. This is sort of the stereotypical image, I think, of the evangelical fundamentalist preacher that comes out so often in Southern literature. Is that a fair depiction, you think, or?
No, I think it's a regrettable depiction because there's so much that's, you know, stereotypes are always, again, they're crutches to not think deeply and clearly, or not to look clearly. And reality as it is so interesting and so complex that to put it in some sort of stereotypical, hyperbolic context it's really a disservice, not to the writer and particularly to the reader and to culture at large. Flannery O'Connor has the famous quote that, you know, for the blind you have to make large, startling gestures, and for the deaf you have to shout. And I suppose there is some of that, right? Much of literature functions to sort of jar us out of the complacency that comes from everyday living. That said, I think we're fully capable of being jarred out of that without these ridiculous stereotypes that, of course, only feed the notion of what we should be working to sort of dismantle.
Right. Speaking of ridiculous stereotypes, let's look at this second image. This is from a movie, actually, A Leap of Faith, with Steve Martin. And of course, he's got the glittery jacket on. He's a faith healer. And the movie depicts largely his exploits and his hypocrisy. And again, that seems to be a stereotypical image of a certain strand of media evangelism, perhaps.
Right. And of course, right, there are these media evangelists like this, but this is escapism at its worst. And I think serious art should not allow us an escape from the world, but thrust us deeper into the world. And when we get an image like Martin, and we get a film like this, and we could sit here and name several others, what we're allowed to do is we're allowed to look down our nose at that, right? There's no inward glance here. There's no attempt to make us self-examine. It's such a ridiculous stereotype. It's easy to dismiss it.
Right.
And that lets us completely off the hook.
I like the way you phrase that. Let me see if I can paraphrase what you said, that serious art shouldn't allow for escapism so much as a deeper inward focus on the topic.
Yeah, Anton Chekhov, the Russian writer, said, the job of the artist isn't to solve the problem, but to state the problem correctly.
So when you get to ridiculous stereotypes like these, you're avoiding the problem. You're not.
Absolutely.
And it deflects the attention away from the reality. Yes. Well, I'd like to turn to your work for a moment, and you can take this where you want. They're your novels, but I had a chance to read The Sheltering, and it is a at once fabulous story and dark story, full of characters who are wounded in different ways. You get this kind of dark view of human nature, and it's set against the backdrop of 9/11, the Iraq War, the conflict in Afghanistan. So I'm wondering, is this, and it's filled with religion. You've got these characters kind of seeking and searching. Is this a comment, in a way, of a new post 9/11 reality in terms of how it's directing our consciousness and how religion perhaps has become even ineffectual in this new reality?
I hope so. I mean, this is my attempt to sort of state the problem correctly. The writer Don DeLillo said, what we are being schooled in right now is the intimacy of distance. And he talks about the notion that there are world events which are simultaneously far removed from our life. I think right now what's happening in, say, Aleppo in Syria. But they are thrust into a sort of immediacy, right, by the possibility of violence, the possibility of terrorism, our ability to empathize with people on the other side of the world. The book came out of a sort of strange place. My wife and I had moved to Florida, and we had moved in just as the economy came tumbling down. Shortly thereafter, I was with a friend, and we were at a bed and breakfast, and my friend was about to go up to his room, and just before, there was a gentleman in the lobby in the common room. He was clearly very drunk. It was very late at night, and he was sort of muttering. So we sat down and we sort of started listening to him and talking to him, and it came out over time that he was a drone pilot. At the time, drones were being flown by civilian contractors out of MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, not too far away. He was either a drone pilot or he knew enough to fake it well. And eventually he passed out, and when we were leaving, my friend made a comment to me that really stuck with me. He said, I would hate to be privy to his inner life. And I thought about that. I thought about what it must be like to be a drone pilot, to be flying a drone on the other side of the world, and to possibly kill someone, and then simply break from that life and go home to this normal suburban American existence, that living by proxy. And the more I thought about it, Ozzie, the more it struck me as sort of the perfect metaphor for post 9/11 America, right? The sort of notion that we are somehow disengaged from the world in which we live, whether it's through online living, whether it's by wars that are fought by a tiny percentage of the population. We have this tremendous influence throughout the world, and yet very seldom do we feel the reverberations. And when we do, they're usually terribly violent.
That's so your encounter with this drone pilot was the inspiration for Luther Redding in The Sheltering. And his own life of disengagement. And it strikes me that survey after survey suggests that millennials in particular feel a disengagement with religion, that religion isn't resonating today with the younger generation as it once did. Is this part of what's coming through in your novel here, this sort of disconnect with...
You know, as I was saying before, I was raised in a fairly religious, a very religious background, and I pretty much dismissed it when I was young. But there was this yawning gap, and eventually what I came to learn was that for all the Sunday school, for all the Bible school, for all the study, for everything, and for all the good intentions of my really wonderful, loving parents and the church I was growing up with, I hadn't done what the Buddha said was the most essential thing, which was to work out my own salvation with diligence, right? And I think that that diligence is something that is, I see it so often absent in large commercial religion, because there is a sort of Christian capitalism, I think, at play. The notion that spirituality is this ladder you're going to climb. It's very American. And it's embodied, I think, in mega churches. It's embodied in, I think, what Bonhoeffer called cheap grace. And I was trying to get at that notion in the book. What happens to people when they are forced to recognize their helplessness in the world, that they have to call on something larger than them? What happens to people when they no longer have the tools to call on something larger, or to recognize the need to call on something larger.
So what you're suggesting here, and this comes out in your novel, on the one hand, the type of religion we see, this, as you called it, a capitalistic style of religion, and you have passing references to megachurch, megachurches and a kind of contemporary evangelical praise type of Christianity. That's failing. Is that part of what you're saying here? It's failing to meet the needs of folk in the 21st century?
Yeah, well, you know, I don't want to be a spokesperson for the anti-megachurch
right,
movement.
We're generalizing greatly here, I'm sure.
But, you know, if that sort of thing fails for me, it fails for me. And maybe it's just that I am sort of a curmudgeon about this. It may be wholly a personal thing. But to me, serious religion, you know, Barth's idea of God as this wholly other thing, should be so intense, it should be so personal, and it should be so life-altering that to have someone projecting words on a teleprompter while they play an electric guitar and you have a coffee bar outside, it just seems to undermine what should largely be this sort of deeply affecting reverential moment that should pervade your life, right? And again, maybe this is just a question less of spirituality and more an issue for me of aesthetics. Right. But it bothers me, and it bothers me deeply. And that was sort of what I was trying to articulate in, I guess, all of my work, but particularly in the last novel.
And I think you've done it beautifully as well.
Thank you.
The capitalization or the capital model of religion brings me to another scene in the sheltering, which is really marvelous. Probably takes up most of a chapter. And it's actually a pivotal moment in the story. And this is a moment when the two sisters, Lucy and Katie, visit a religious theme park called the Holy Land. Now, when I read that, I thought immediately Heritage USA, because I grew up in North Carolina, and that was the big Christian theme park of the Bakers back in the 80s. But you've informed me that there is actually a theme park called the Holy Land in Orlando.
There is. I wish I could take credit for having the imagination to dream such, but there is an actual theme park in Orlando. I visited it once. I took my son along because I wanted to photograph things that I didn't want people to think I was some strange middle-aged man wandering through this park. You know, it's like this embodiment of misguided good intentions. And again, I'm speaking this is such a personal view that obviously for some people it may have a profound impact. But I went through it and it just felt so crass, and it felt so antithetical to the notion that you should be locked in the closet alone praying, right? It felt like something built out of the very notions of the Pharisees.
So you're painting the picture here now through the mega churches, through the healing evangelists, through this idea of a Christian theme park, of a kind of superficial veneer of religion over maybe a Band-Aid on the problems of society. It's really not operating productively, but it's there still. We can't quite let go of it. We're still clinging to it.
Right.
One of your characters, Lucy, is an adolescent filled with adolescent angst, and she has this conversion experience. But it seems like, and maybe I'm wrong here, but it's also this kind of veneer, superficial experience, and maybe that's a comment that adolescence and in her case sexual awakening and spiritual awakening all kind of come together in this mixed bag. Is that a picture you're trying to paint as well?
Yeah, I mean, to me she's a very admirable and tragic figure in that she is working really hard, attempting to work out her own salvation, right, to figure out what it is she believes and where she fits in the world. But the world isn't prepared to give her any guidance in this, right? All of the larger institutions that we could have relied on, physically and metaphorically, have largely disappeared. I remember once when we first moved to Florida, as houses were being foreclosed on us everywhere, right? And this is in the height of the Iraq War, the surge. I remember hearing someone say, "There isn't an adult in sight." And it struck me that there wasn't a single figure I could look to in our larger culture who could offer some sort of mature guidance of how to weather these storms. Because those things, you know, they're largely gone. The theorist Chris Hedges talks about this, the end of liberal progressive institutions that used to be anchors for our society. Right. And the progressive mainline church, universities, the media, all of these things, right? We've seen so much of it disappear in the course of my lifetime. Certainly, but I think prior to that too.
See, and then in the context of what you're talking about here, about the decline of the institution of the church and this kind of superficiality of religion, you've got a scene of some conversion experiences that these teenagers have at the Holy Land, I think. So again, that seems to be kind of a comment on the superficiality of this type of highly emotionally charged, even sexualized kind of religious experience. And then when Lucy does experience a crisis, she begins to question her faith, and it doesn't seem to be operating for her very well. Is that another kind of example of this theme that you're spinning here?
Certainly, and I'm starting to scare myself, Ozzie, because I almost didn't realize that I felt so strongly about this. But yeah, this is something that troubles me deeply. What happens when we are forced back onto tools and means which we no longer possess?
Right.
And the institutions which were there to give us guidance, which were there to sort of create these kind of framework in which we can work out our own worldview. What happens when those hedges are gone? And we're left adrift in the world. And the book is really about being adrift, spiritually and physically adrift as well.
Let's switch to another character.
Sure.
Bobby. Okay, and I had to make this short, but Bobby and Donnie are brothers, are on this cross-country drug-fueled adventure of sorts. And toward the end, Bobby wanders into a Roman Catholic church. He's not Catholic.
Right.
He's not even religious necessarily, but he has a type of confession, receives a type of absolution. Is that something different from the evangelical conversion, or is it again an example of this kind of superficiality of religion, or did Bobby find a meaningful outlet there?
I don't know. I hope he did, but maybe what it is me as the author hoping. I feel I've spent my whole life so opposed to authority, so opposed to sort of any kind of top-down institution, that there was some point, maybe in the last decade or so, I realized that I was sort of adrift, and I actually needed some sort of larger constraint in my thought. I think what Bobby's looking for is the idea that there's still some authority in the world, right? And still, if there's still some authority, there is still someone who can forgive him for what's happened.
Right.
And whether or not that is the case or not, I don't know.
Yeah.
But that's certainly what he's hoping for.
That's a really nice image, particularly juxtaposed against the Holy Land experience. So it seems to me then that in your work, and what I hear you saying is that religion is kind of always there. And in the depiction of religion in your novels provides a kind of prophetic critique of the way religion exists in America today, as a kind of almost a gasping, dying institution. Is there hope for religion, or is it going to die away?
No, absolutely. If there's hope for us, there's hope for religion, right? I mean, I think that's our hope is sort of vested in the idea that there is something larger and better than us. And what form that'll take, I don't know. I was thinking about, I was in divinity school, if you recall the Abu Ghraib photographs, right, from Iraq, when those came, and that sort of underpins my third novel. And I remember thinking, if this doesn't move the church, right, the similarity of these images to the crucifixion, if this doesn't do it, what will? And I felt convinced at the time that we were on the verge of something major, some sort of some kind of reinvigoration of real, genuine, active faith. And of course, it didn't happen, right? If anything, we marched on to the wars in Iraq, the wars, continued wars, financial disaster, all of these things we see now. So I don't know about institutionalized religion, I don't know, but I certainly, if there's hope for us, and I feel like I'm articulating this incredibly bleak view, and I suppose I am. Nevertheless, I wake up every day and I'm so grateful to see my wife and my children. I'm so grateful, to be outside, to be in the world, to be around good people, to talk about these things. Maybe you just have to live in that tension, right? Karl Rahner said, true belief is orientation toward mystery, right? And maybe that reorienting ourselves toward mystery, living in that tension, doing what Rilke called living the questions, right? Instead of replacing the wrong answers with the right questions. Maybe that's the future of religion in whatever kind of form it assumes.
Well, I think you have painted a dark picture, but I don't think it's a picture without hope or a picture without grace. It seems to run under the current of what you're doing. Mark, a very talented writer, and you have told these stories and not shied away from some controversial depictions of the way religion exists in our society and the way people use religion as a crutch or as a hiding place. And I'm looking forward to reading the rest of your works, and I would encourage you just to keep on writing.
Well, thank you so much, Ozzie.
And I appreciate you coming on the program today to talk about how religion operates in literature. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, that's our program for this week. Next time, Islam and Evolution. And until then, I'm Ozzie Ostwalt. Goodbye.